Welcome to Brainwaves and Breakthroughs.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really digging into a set of sources you've shared, articles, internal documents, research, all pointing towards this, well, pretty critical and honestly quite disturbing tension in the car industry.
It really is. It's this fundamental conflict between, the drive for profit by automotive companies and the absolute necessity of keeping consumers safe. And history shows, it shows this balance hasn't always been struck correctly. We've seen documented cases where safety was compromised, leading to preventable harm.
Right, so our mission today is to sift through all this material, pull out the really key takeaways, and sort of unpack what the sources describe as this almost chilling calculus behind some corporate decisions. We want to make this complex history clear and memorable for you.
And the core question right from the start is pretty stark. How does an industry known for these incredible engineering achievements, vehicles that literally shape our lives, sometimes end up making decisions kind of in the shadows where it seems like a monetary value gets put on human life? The sources point to this troubling historical pattern.
Yeah.
It's not just about accidents, it's about choices where safety was demonstrably and knowingly compromised, often it seems for financial reasons.
Okay, let's really get into that core tension then. On one side, you've got mass production, efficiency targets, profit maximization, all the business pressures.
And on the other, this non-negotiable requirement.
Right.
The product you're selling that millions of people rely on daily has to be fundamentally safe.
What the sources really emphasize is how this tension keeps bubbling up. You see these scandals involving huge household names.
Yeah.
It kind of suggests it's not just isolated incidents, but maybe systemic vulnerabilities.
Exactly. And it forces you to ask that really uncomfortable question. Are the consequences, like fines or lawsuit payouts, actually enough to deter this behavior? Or have they sometimes been treated as, just another cost of doing business, something to be weighed against the profits you might make by, say, delaying a safety fix or keeping a problem quiet?
Yeah, the sources describe this almost detached approach, sometimes found within corporate cultures, where shareholder value seems to occasionally take precedence over human well-being, often with just devastating results.
And this includes those, infamous internal memos, the ones where they literally assign a dollar value to a human life or a serious injury when they're weighing the costs and benefits of a safety measure.
Which leads us, I think, inevitably to the most famous, maybe the most notorious example of this, the Ford Pinto.
Ah, yes, the Pinto. It's become almost a textbook case, hasn't it?
The car with that horrific nickname, the barbecue that seats four. What exactly was the fatal flaw?
Fundamentally, it was the fuel tank, its design, and critically, its placement. Ford put it behind the rear axle, really close to the differential housing.
And there wasn't much protecting it?
No, not really. Insufficient reinforcement. So even in relatively low-speed rear-end collisions, we're talking maybe 20, 25 miles per hour in some tests shown in the sources, the tank could get punctured by bolts sticking out from the differential or just crushed.
Leading to fuel spills and, fire. And the bumper wasn't much help either, I gather.
Didn't offer substantial protection, no. But what makes the Pinto story so damning, according to these sources, is the evidence that Ford knew about this vulnerability.
They knew beforehand.
Internal documents, crash test reports from way back in the development phase apparently showed the danger before the car even hit the showrooms, and testimony later suggested this awareness went quite high up.
The sources mentioned that incredible rush to get the car to market, just 25 months, was it? To fight off competition from VW and Japanese imports?
Right. And then there's that disputed but widely cited quote attributed to Leah Coca at the time, "Safety doesn't sell." Plus, a confidential 1971 memo that apparently directed engineers not to add extra safety features unless the law absolutely required them.
Which brings us straight to that memo, the Pinto memo. This wasn't just like an offhand comment. This is a documented cost-benefit analysis, right?
Explicitly laid out. The engineers estimated a fix, basically adding a protective bladder or some reinforcement, would cost about $11 per vehicle.
$11.
$11. You multiply that across the millions of cars and trucks they plan to build, and it came out to roughly $137 million total cost for the fix.
Okay, now for the truly chilling part. The memo then compared that $137 million to what?
To the estimated cost of future lawsuits. And they used specific figures, which the sources say were actually based on government and HTSA data from that era. Around $200,000 for a predicted burn death, and about $67,000 for a serious burn injury. Yeah. Based on their own internal projections of how many such incidents might occur, they calculated the total potential payout from lawsuits and settlements would be somewhere around $50 million.
So the memo's conclusion was,
The conclusion, starkly, was that it was cheaper financially speaking to pay out damages for the predicted deaths and injuries than it was to spend the $137 million to implement the fix for the known fire hazard.
using government figures almost makes it seem procedural, doesn't it? But it feels like a huge ethical line was crossed there.
Absolutely. The sources point out that using those NHTSA figures might have provided a sort of regulatory cover, blurring the line between assessing risk for planning purposes and a company's moral responsibility for a defect they knew could be lethal.
And the human cost wasn't theoretical. The sources mention the specific case of Lily Gray, who died, and Richard Grimshaw, a teenager with her, who was terribly burned in a 1972 Pinto crash. Their lawsuit was pivotal.
It was. And while the total number of Pinto fire deaths is debated, you see figures ranging from initial high estimates down to maybe a few dozen in later analyses. The core points remain largely undisputed in the sources. Ford knew about the risk beforehand, and they performed that cost-benefit analysis weighing lives against dollars.
The Grimshaw v. Ford case, what was the outcome?
A landmark verdict in '78. The jury awarded significant compensatory damages, but also huge punitive damages against Ford. Basically, a punishment. The amount was reduced on appeal, but it was still massive for its time, and the appeals court upheld the finding that Ford had shown a callous disregard of public safety.
And what about regulators, NHTSA? Where were they in all this?
Well, interestingly, when the Pinto was designed, there wasn't actually a specific federal rule about fuel tank strength in rear-end crashes. NHTSA really only launched a full investigation after a lot of public pressure built up.
Fueled by that Mother Jones article. Pinto madness.
Exactly. Mark Dowie's article came out right around the time of the Grimshaw trial and really ignited public outrage. It put immense pressure on both Ford and the regulators.
So NHTSA had to play catch-up.
Pretty much. And the sources explain something quite telling. The Pinto technically met a later, weaker fuel tank standard that came into effect. NHTSA actually had to devise tougher tests, using a heavier bullet car at slightly higher speeds to reliably demonstrate the defect and the real-world danger the initial standard didn't capture.
And Ford eventually recalled the cars.
Yes, in 1978, they initiated what was termed a voluntary recall, about 1.5 million Pintos and related models to install safety upgrades.
The whole Pinto affair really left a mark, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It was a watershed. It heavily influenced product liability law, the use of punitive damages, and it really highlighted the power of investigative journalism and public outcry enforcing corporate accountability.
Okay, let's shift gears. Fast forward a few decades, and the sources point to echoes of this pattern, maybe in a different way, at General Motors with their ignition switch problems.
Yes, the GM ignition switch scandal. Another case involving a hidden defect known internally for years before any real action was taken.
What was the flaw itself? It seems almost minor on the surface.
It was in the ignition switches in millions of cars. Chevy Cobalts, Saturn Ions, others. The switches simply didn't have enough torque, enough spring tension, meaning the key could too easily get knocked or jiggle out of the run position, maybe by the driver's knee bumping it, or a heavy keychain, or just driving on a rough road.
And if that happened while driving?
The consequences were catastrophic. The engine would shut off instantly. That meant losing power steering, making the car incredibly hard to steer. Power brakes would lose their assist, needing much more force.
Okay, that's bad enough.
But the critical part, the truly lethal part often, was that it also cut power to the airbags. So in the very crash that might result from losing control, the safety system designed to protect the occupants wouldn't deploy.
And GM knew about this. The sources detail a timeline.
A shocking timeline, really. Engineers apparently knew about problems with the switch design as far back as 2001 during pre-production testing. The supplier, Delphi, reportedly told GM in 2001 that many switches weren't meeting the specifications.
But GM approved them anyway.
Approved them in 2002, yes. Customer complaints about stalling started coming in by 2003. An internal engineer specifically noted the key bump issue causing stalls in a Cobalt in 2004. They knew.
So why the delay? Again, does it come back to cost?
According to the sources, cost was a major factor. By 2005, internal discussions were happening about potential fixes, but the conclusion documented was that the tooling costs were too high, the lead time too long. They essentially found no acceptable business case for a proper redesign at that point.
Instead of fixing it, they did what?
They decided just to issue a service bulletin suggesting a small key insert, not addressing the switch itself. Internal documents mention engineers discussing pushing off a full redesign until 2008, citing what seemed like incredibly low costs, around $400,000 for retooling and maybe 90 cents per car for the part.
90 cents per car.
That's the figure cited in some reports, yes. And meetings about this known problem were apparently held repeatedly from 2005 onward without triggering a recall or a proper fix.
And then there was something about a part number.
Yes. This is a particularly crucial and deceptive part of the story, according to investigators. In 2006, a GM engineer named Ray DiGiorgio quietly approved a design change to the switch to increase the torque. But, and this is key, he deliberately did not authorize changing the part number for the improved switch.
Why is that significant?
Because it made it incredibly difficult for anyone investigating crashes later, whether inside GM or external investigators like NHTSA, to distinguish between the old faulty switches and the new improved ones. It effectively masked the existence of the original defect and the subsequent fix, delaying the identification of the root cause for years. An act of obfuscation, the sources call it.
GM eventually did its own internal investigation,
Yeah.
the Valukas report.
Yes, released in 2014, it was extensive, and its findings were quite critical. It didn't find proof of a specific high-level corporate directive to cover up the defect, but it described what it called a pattern of incompetence and neglect that spanned more than a decade.
Incompetence and neglect.
It noted that the atmosphere of cost-cutting had an impact, making engineers feel there were no extra funds for product improvements. It painted a picture of a dysfunctional corporate culture.
How so? What kind of dysfunction?
Things like information silos, where critical safety data in one department didn't get shared with others who needed it. And the infamous GM nod.
The GM nod.
Yeah, the report described this phenomenon where engineers or managers would raise a problem in a meeting, everyone would nod in agreement that it was an issue, but then nothing would actually happen. No follow-up, no action assigned. The problem also got repeatedly misclassified internally as just a customer convenience issue, like annoyance with stalling, because the deadly link between the switch moving and the airbags failing wasn't properly understood or communicated across the company.
So it wasn't necessarily one person covering it up, but the system itself failed.
The report suggests this diffusion of responsibility across multiple committees and departments, this systemic dysfunction, was in many ways just as devastating as a deliberate cover-up might have been. It led to deadly inaction.
And the human toll.
Heartbreaking. GM set up an independent compensation fund administered by Kenneth Feinberg. That fund ultimately identified 124 deaths directly linked to the faulty ignition switch.
That's far more than the initial reports.
Way more. GM initially only acknowledged 13 deaths. It's worth noting the fund rejected the vast majority of claims filed, over 90%, so some argue the actual toll could be even higher. Many victims were young drivers in those smaller cars.
How did GM respond once this finally came to light?
The recalls finally started in February 2014, initially for about 800,000 Cobalts and Pontiac G5s, but they kept expanding throughout the year, eventually covering nearly 30 million vehicles worldwide.
And there were revelations about when they really knew to act.
Yes, internal emails surfaced showing GM had actually placed a large order for the redesigned replacement switches months before they announced the first public recall. That didn't look good.
What were the penalties?
They were substantial. GM entered into a deferred prosecution agreement with the Department of Justice in 2015, paying a $900 million forfeiture. They admitted to failing to disclose the defect to NHTSA in a timely manner and misleading consumers. They also had to accept an independent safety monitor.
And the victim fund.
That fund paid out nearly $600 million to victims and their families for those 124 deaths and hundreds of injuries. NHTSA also imposed its maximum civil penalty at the time, $35 million, for the delay in reporting. Then there were other settlements, like with the SEC.
Did GM try to change things internally after this?
They announced major reforms, reorganizations, creating a new global safety organization with a stated goal of 0 defects, launching a program called Speak Up for Safety to encourage employees to report concerns without fear, a whole revamp of ethics and compliance training, trying to fix that culture described in the Valukas report.
What about NHTSA's role? Did they face criticism too?
They did. A House committee report in 2014 was quite critical, suggesting NHTSA had enough information to potentially identify the defect pattern as early as 2007, but either missed it or lacked the expertise. They pointed to examples like a Wisconsin state trooper who had correctly linked the switch position to airbag failures in a crash report years earlier.
How did NHTSA respond to that?
NHTSA defended itself, partly, but they also acknowledged shortcomings. In 2015, the agency administrator admitted they had missed signs, perhaps didn't fully understand the technology involved, and had been too trusting of information from automakers. It raised questions about regulatory resources, expertise, and maybe being too differential to the industry they oversee.
Okay, so Pinto, GM. The third major case the sources highlight is Takata. This one feels different. It's a supplier, and the scale is just enormous.
Absolutely. The Takata airbag crisis is staggering. It involved a fundamental flaw in parts supplied to numerous automakers worldwide, resulting in the largest automotive recall in history. A real ticking time bomb, as you said.
What was the specific defect here?
It's centered on Takata's choice of chemical propellant for the airbag inflators, ammonium nitrate. The problem is, ammonium nitrate can degrade over time, especially when exposed to heat and humidity cycles. It becomes unstable.
Unstable how? What happens when the airbag deploys?
When the airbag is triggered in a crash, the degraded ammonium nitrate can burn too quickly, too aggressively. It generates far more pressure than intended inside the metal inflator canister.
And the canister?
The canister ruptures. Violently, it explodes, essentially, sending sharp metal fragments, shrapnel flying out at high velocity directly into the passenger cabin, towards the driver or passenger. The sources use chilling language, describing it as turning a life-saving device into an improvised grenade.
That's terrifying. And again, the question of foreknowledge. Did Takata know?
The evidence presented in the sources indicates a long and deeply disturbing pattern of deception and concealed knowledge. Takata apparently knew from as early as the year 2000 that some of their inflators weren't meeting specifications and were rupturing during internal tests.
Yet they kept selling them. How?
According to legal documents and investigations cited in the sources, Takata actively persuaded automakers to buy their inflators by submitting false and fraudulent test reports. They manipulated data, cherry-picked results, and crucially, omitted data showing the inflator ruptures they were observing in their own labs. Internal communications reportedly discussed this data falsification.
Were there people inside trying to raise alarms?
Yes. Whistleblowers played an absolutely critical role here. The sources mentioned Mark Lilly, a former Takata engineer who resigned back in 2001. He apparently warned executives directly, saying something like, "If we go forward with this, somebody will be killed." He later provided evidence showing Takata knew about the dangers from at least 1999.
So years before the recalls.
Years. And later, another anonymous whistleblower apparently exposed a systematic process of data falsification, overriding procedures, hiding unfavorable reports, and even terminating employees who raised objections.
Did competitors know about this chemical being risky?
It seems so. The sources mentioned that a major competitor, Autoliv, had evaluated ammonium nitrate back in the late 90s, concluded it was too volatile, and refused to use it. They reportedly even warned some automakers about the risks.
But Takatas were cheaper.
That seems to have been a key factor. Market pressure for lower-cost components likely kept automakers buying Takata's inflators despite potential warnings. And Takata, according to the findings, continued the deception even as reports of field failures and injuries started to emerge. Sources indicate there was little to no internal discipline for those involved until around 2015, despite executive awareness.
And the deception went beyond airbags.
Disturbingly, yes. In 2021, the company that bought Takata's assets after bankruptcy reportedly found over 1,000 instances where Takata had also falsified seatbelt safety test data provided to automakers. It suggests a really pervasive, deeply ingrained culture of deception.
The scale of the human impact is hard to grasp.
It's global and tragic. Just in the U.S., NHTSA has confirmed 28 deaths and over 400 injuries directly linked to these rupturing Takata inflators. Worldwide, the death toll is at least 35, with hundreds, maybe thousands, more injured. And these parts were used by at least 19 different car manufacturers.
Which explains the size of the recall.
Unprecedented. An estimated 67 million defective inflators were called in the U.S. alone, and well over 100 million globally. Managing that recall, finding the owners, prioritizing the highest risk vehicles, older cars in hot, humid climates, getting them repaired, it's been a monumental and ongoing challenge. Millions of these potentially dangerous inflators are likely still in cars on the road today.
What happened to Takata itself?
The fallout was immense. The company pleaded guilty to criminal wire fraud in the U.S. in January 2017. They agreed to pay a $1 billion criminal penalty.
$1 billion. Where did that money go?
It was broken down. $125 million went into a fund for injured victims. $850 million was designated to help reimburse automakers for the massive recall costs, and there was a $25 million criminal fine. NHTSA had already imposed a $200 million civil penalty back in 2015.
And the company survived.
No. Overwhelmed by the liabilities from recalls and lawsuits worldwide, Takata filed for bankruptcy protection in both Japan and the U.S. in June 2017. Its viable assets were eventually sold off.
What about the automakers who use these parts?
They faced staggering costs, $2 billion collectively for recall repairs. Companies like GM, Ford, Honda reported huge financial hits, plus significant reputational damage and scrutiny over why they relied on these cheaper, ultimately defective parts. It really exposed the vulnerability of the entire automotive supply chain.
And again, whistleblowers were key.
Absolutely vital. Their courage in coming forward was critical in exposing the full extent of the fraud. It's noted in the sources that the Takata scandal, along with the GM case, heavily influenced the passage of the Motor Vehicle Safety Whistleblower Act in 2015, which offers potential financial rewards to encourage insiders to report defects.
It also raises questions about regulating global suppliers, right?
Definitely. It highlighted the immense challenge for national regulators like NHTSA trying to oversee components manufactured by global suppliers, installed in vehicles assembled internationally, and sold across borders. It really pointed to a need for a much stronger international cooperation on safety standards and oversight.
Now, these three, Pinto, GM, Takata, are huge cases, but the sources suggest they aren't entirely unique. There are other examples reinforcing this pattern of profits, sometimes trumping safety.
Yes, the sources briefly touch on a couple of others that fit the theme. One is the Ford Firestone tire controversy from the late 90s, early 2000s.
I remember that. Tires falling apart on Ford Explorers.
Exactly. Tread separation on certain Firestone tire models, particularly when fitted to Ford Explorers, led to numerous rollovers. The official toll was at least 238 deaths and over 500 injuries just in the U.S.
And there was a lot of finger pointing there, wasn't there?
Oh, huge public battle. Ford blamed defects in Firestone tires, especially from a specific plant. Firestone blamed the design of the Ford Explorer, arguing its high center of gravity made it inherently prone to rolling over. Firestone also pointed to Ford's recommended low tire pressure, apparently requested by Ford for a smoother ride and maybe better fuel economy, saying it caused the tires to overheat and fail.
So responsibility was kind of blurred between the automaker and the supplier.
Very much so. It illustrated how complex these relationships can be and how responsibility can get diffused. It resulted in massive recalls by both companies, Firestone recalling millions of tires, Ford eventually replacing millions more.
Did anything change legally after that?
Yes, significantly. That controversy directly led to Congress passing the Tread Act in 2000. It mandated tougher tire safety standards and, crucially, required automakers and suppliers to report potential safety defects, including claims data and information from overseas recalls, much more quickly and comprehensively to NHTSA. It was meant to prevent that kind of situation from escalating unnoticed again.
Okay, and the other example mentioned?
Toyota's unintended acceleration issues, roughly around 2004 to 2010. Vehicles suddenly speeding up without driver input.
Right, there was a lot of debate about whether it was electronics or something else.
There was. While electronic causes were investigated and largely ruled out by regulators, the primary confirmed culprits were mechanical. Floor mats that could trap the accelerator pedal, and a separate issue with sticky accelerator pedals caused by a specific plastic material used in a component from a supplier.
And how did Toyota handle it?
Their response came under heavy criticism. The Department of Justice investigation, which resulted in a $1.2 billion criminal penalty in 2014, found that Toyota had misled consumers and regulators. Specifically, they were accused of downplaying and concealing the sticky pedal problem, while publicly claiming that a more limited recall focused only on floor mats had addressed the root cause of the acceleration issues.
So another instance of not being fully transparent.
Exactly. Strategic omissions, misleading assurances, trying to contain the problem rather than addressing all known causes promptly. Again, these cases echo those themes. Delays, cost considerations seemingly influencing fixes, and transparency issues with regulators and the public.
Okay, so let's pull back a bit and talk about the underlying issues these cases raise. Things like corporate culture and this idea of devaluing human life that seems to run through some of these examples.
Right. As you said earlier, the sources suggest it's often not just isolated mistakes by individuals, but something more systemic. It's about the environment, the incentives, the culture within these large organizations.
That Pinto memo really stands out as the starkest example of what you call the calculus of catastrophe, putting a price tag on death and injury.
It's the archetype, isn't it? And the sources stress the ethical distinction. Regulatory agencies might use statistical values of life for broad policy planning or resource allocation. But for a company to use those figures internally to decide not to fix a known preventable defect that they understand has lethal potential, that's crossing a fundamental ethical line. It treats human lives as mere financial variables on a spreadsheet.
And the language used internally matters too, doesn't it?
Hugely. Look at GM calling the deadly ignition switch flaw a customer convenience issue. Using euphemisms like that minimizes the severity. It can contribute to what sociologists call the normalization of deviance, where under pressure for cost or speed, things that should be seen as unacceptable safety risks gradually become treated as normal, manageable problems.
Corporate culture seems absolutely central in these stories.
Pivotal. Whether it's the alleged safety doesn't sell attitude attributed to Ford leadership during the Pinto years, or that 1971 memo suggesting a purely reactive approach to safety regulations.
Or the GM culture lie bare by the Volucker's report.
Exactly. The information silos, the GM nod signifying inaction, the pervasive fear of raising costly issues due to that extraordinary cost-cutting pressure, it created a situation where responsibility was so diffused, nobody felt empowered or obligated to stop the train. The system itself seemed to block safety efforts.
Yeah, and changing that culture is hard, presumably.
Incredibly hard. Companies often implement new programs after scandals like GM's Speak Up for Safety, and those are important steps. But truly transforming a deeply ingrained culture, shifting priorities away from just cost and schedule towards genuinely valuing safety, that takes sustained commitment from the very top, and it's much harder than just writing new policy manuals.
Which points to leadership and incentives.
Absolutely. When leaders relentlessly push for extreme cost targets, like the Pinto's alleged $2,000 car, 2,000 pounds mandate, or when bonuses and promotions are tied primarily to hitting costs and schedule goals without equally weighting safety outcomes, it inevitably skews priorities down the line. Safety needs to be built into the core metrics and reward systems.
So let's talk about accountability. After these tragedies happen, what does the path to justice and hopefully safer roads look like? It seems complex.
It's often a long and arduous process involving litigation, regulatory action, and internal reform.
Litigation seems powerful. Those product liability lawsuits, like Grimshaw v. Ford, they can hit companies hard, especially with punitive damages.
They can. Punitive damages are specifically meant to punish companies for egregious behavior and deter future misconduct. We saw huge figures awarded or agreed upon in settlements for Pinto, GM, Takata.
But does it really deter them? Or is it sometimes, as we discussed, just factored in as cost?
That's the ongoing debate. For companies with the billions in annual revenue, are even massive penalties truly enough to change fundamental behavior, especially if the misconduct generated profits for many years? The sources also note it's historically been very rare for individuals within corporations to face criminal charges in these kinds of cases.
What about the regulators like NHTSA? They're supposed to be the main watchdog.
They are the primary federal agency responsible for vehicle safety standards and recalls in the U.S. But as we've seen, they've faced criticism, sometimes for being too slow, too reactive, stepping in only after many injuries or deaths have occurred.
Like with Pinto and GM.
Right. Other criticisms include potentially overlooking evidence, lacking the necessary technical expertise or resources to keep up with industry complexity, and sometimes appearing too reliant on or trusting of the information automakers provide them.
So reforms happened, like the TREAD Act after Firestone.
Yes, crises often spur legislative and regulatory reforms, but the challenge remains to make oversight more proactive, anticipating risks rather than just reacting to failures. And the global nature of the industry, as Takata showed, adds another layer of complexity for national regulators.
Despite all this, have there been positive long-term impacts from these terrible events?
Yes, absolutely. The sources do point to progress. Safety standards have become significantly stronger over the decades. Think about fuel tank integrity rules after the Pinto, advanced airbag requirements, electronic stability control mandates, tougher roof crush standards. Vehicle testing protocols are more rigorous.
And within the companies themselves.
There's definitely been a much greater emphasis, at least publicly, on corporate ethics, compliance programs, and building safety cultures, particularly in companies that have gone through these crises. Consumer awareness is also much higher now, and the internet allows safety concerns to spread much faster.
And whistleblower protections.
Stronger protections, yes, including those potential financial rewards under the 2015 Act, are designed to encourage people with inside knowledge to come forward sooner.
It seems like pressure from outside the industry and government is often key.
Critically important. The sources repeatedly underscored the vital role of civil society. Investigative journalists like Mark Dowie, dedicated safety advocates like Ralph Nader and his successors, consumer groups, and crucially, those internal whistleblowers. Often it's their work, their courage, their persistence that first brings these issues to light and generates the public pressure needed to force action when corporate and regulatory systems fail.
So wrapping this up, this deep dive into the sources really reveals a clear, if unsettling pattern, doesn't it? In these major automotive safety scandals, Pinto, GM, Takata, and others, there are documented instances where the drive for profit appears to have been prioritized over safety, with truly tragic results.
The common threads are disturbingly consistent. Evidence of foreknowledge within the company, internal cost-benefit analyses that implicitly or explicitly put a price on human life, corporate cultures that sometimes fostered secrecy or inaction, and regulatory systems that struggled to keep pace or identify problems early.
And why does this history matter for you listening today? Well, these aren't just stories from the past. They highlight an ongoing tension in many industries, and they underscore why constant vigilance is needed from regulators, from the corporations themselves, and importantly, from the public and consumers like you.
Which leaves us with this final thought to chew on. As cars get exponentially more complex, filled with software, sensors, moving towards autonomous driving, how do these hard-learned lessons apply? The lessons about the dangers of cutting corners on safety, concealing risks, ignoring warnings, letting bureaucracy lead to inaction. Can an industry with this history truly embed a safety-first culture deeply enough to manage these new complexities, especially under intense competitive pressure? Or does that fundamental risk, the temptation to prioritize speed and profit over potentially saving lives, remain an inherent danger we constantly need to guard against?